Hello and welcome to the MAST 2025 webinar. Our speaker today is a marine ecologist that studies animal communication in aquatic habitats. They use soundscapes as indicators of habitat quality and work on coastal enhancements to promote ecological improvement, educational opportunities, and coastal resilience. Please welcome Dr. Anna McGregor.
Hi there. Thanks, Philip. Thanks for that introduction. And it's really nice to be able to speak to you today and share a project that I've been working on with some colleagues across the university. It's actually been really quite exciting. So this is exploring the historical distributions of native oyster, Ostrea edulis, through an analysis of Scottish place names, Esseren, Murech, X, Igus, Otterin. So, and I do want to start off by acknowledging my colleagues, Carly McNamara, who is a medieval historian, and Alistair White, who is a lecturer in Celtic onomastics, and I'll go into that a little bit in a moment. So this was the result of a NERC-funded cross-discipline exchange, staff skills exchange, and I think has really led to some interesting ideas going forward. So let's hopefully this will progress pretty well. There you go. If you're not aware, oysters and bivalve shellfish provides really crucial ecosystem services across a number of levels, both in terms of benefits to the environment, things like increased biodiversity, increased water clarity, stabilization of sediments, and some chemical nitrification processes speeding up the cycling. So this is a really nice figure that was produced as part of the Native Oyster Handbook, grouping those into the different ecosystem services. And the other really interesting bit is they actually have a really strong cultural value, which I will speak about, and a lot of the results of this link into the historical cultural value of shellfish. And it's, I think, always worth thinking about that's how it changed over time, particularly as a result of their exploitation. So the map on the right side shows a census that was done, evaluation of oyster populations, mostly in the North Sea, done in about 1886, I think it was. And it shows the sort of peachy patches show where native oysters could be found, particularly for human consumption was why this was part of a piscatorial atlas where they went around and mapped various fish populations at that time, or fisheries populations. So hopefully you can see they're quite coastal. I mean, there used to be a huge population off the coast of Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and then quite a few distributions coastally around the UK, Scotland, England as well. Now they're virtually absent. Something like over 90% of their historical distribution is entirely absent. And when you think about it, for an animal that survives forming beds that requires the dead shells, empty shells for the settlement of the larvae, not having the shells, not having the beds there is really a big hurdle for them to, in terms of restoration. But when you think about it, you know, the loss of these animals has really massive effects on the ecosystems. And there's really some nice literature looking at the extent of that effect. There's also been some really nice studies recently by Ruth Thurston and colleagues trying to map historical distributions around Europe. And this is just an amazing piece of work where they really searched through a number of types of sources to look for where oyster reefs used to be across Europe. So the map here shows with the was an area that could be calculated from historical sources. The crosses on that map show where there was mention of a reef, but not actual sizes attributed to it. So our work really builds on this, looking at, and if you look at Scotland, there's lots of crosses, not so many actual area calculations, and I'll go into that in a little bit. Another really interesting thing to keep in mind too is the timescales involved. So once we get to about 1800, there's lots of recorded records. There's lots of commercial records of oysters being extracted, harvested, and then sent to various other parts of the country. But prior to about 1800, there are very few records, and I'll mention a little bit about that, particularly in the Scottish context in a second. There's a really nice chapter in the book here, The Firth of Forth by Smout and Stewart. It's a really interesting book overall, going through various environmental history aspects relative to the Firth of Forth. But it does talk a lot about the oyster wars that happened in the Forth. So the Firth of Forth had a major oyster population and industry up until it crashed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But when you're talking about Scotland, there is quite a big both cultural and physical landscape difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. So, you know, the Forth on the East Coast is what's considered the lowlands, stretching up to Aberdeenshire coast, where you have a very different physical landscape. You know, the geomorphology is very different than the West Coast. And that actually is also has created, is entwined with the cultural divisions in the country. So you have a very separate highland culture and lowland culture that results in a lot of different sort of aspects that we can use today, particularly when you're talking about historical records. So hopefully everybody's spent some time on the West Coast and has seen some of the majestic scenery, the craggy cliffs, the beautiful lochs, but it did really limit transport, and you end up having lots of sort of separated communities on the West Coast, which has resulted in sort of also different uses of the natural resources. So what we wanted to do through this work was to see if we could use what's called a toponymic approach to identify Scottish place names across the different languages around native oyster. So Roddy McLean in 2021 produced a scoping report with NatureScot on ecosystem services in Gaelic. And much of this covered looking at different sort of animal populations, animal and tree populations from a historical perspective using place names. So I managed to run across this report just after COVID and thought, well, let's try this with oysters because there's very few left in the waters around Scotland. So let's see if it actually works in practice. He does mention shellfish in general in this report. So I approached Alistair and Carly and said, you know, do you think this would work? And they did an incredible job in carrying out the next steps in terms of the research around this. So we went, or I should say they went and looked through historical texts to identify locations. They also then looked at maps to look at the names that are on those places using the linguistic history to figure out where names for oysters could have been used. And then the next piece was to go out to some of those places and collect the environmental data to look at the substrate types, the waters, to see if these places would be suitable for oysters or shellfish, with the ultimate gain of trying to encourage or help communities connect with the potential for any enhancement or restoration work in those areas. If you're not familiar, there is actually quite a significant amount of work looking towards marine enhancements for seagrass, for priority marine features, seagrass, salt marshes, and shellfish, to try to encourage and sort of improve our coastal waters. So if you haven't run across it, which I didn't at the start of this project, but what toponymics is it's a study of place names using the relevant languages. So in Scotland, there are 6 linguistic origins that place names can come from, and there are sort of regional patterns. So you need a really solid understanding of the language and also sort of the change in the language over time. So why does this work? Obviously, at some point in time, people associated a word with that place. And then you can tell a lot more. So that's sort of the first pass. But then there's a lot in terms of how that changes over time. And that can be a result of changing political, historical landscapes in a particular place. And that comes up, you know, there's a lot of reasons why things might get renamed, or those names also can be lost. So this is a brief quote from a book, actually, talking a little bit, an introduction to why place names are really useful, because they're social constructs that show people's connection to the land they live in. They help communities navigate and orientate, pass down oral traditions, and demonstrate the changes to the landscape. And I think this is really relevant to a place like the west coast of Scotland, where actually a lot of their oral traditions are a really key part of the culture there. So by using that connection with the cultural background, the cultural past, we can learn a lot about why things were important, and so why they got a place name. If this is interesting to you, there are actually quite a lot of resources you can use. There's a Scottish Place Name Society, and actually Salmór Ostaig up in Skye runs an online place names course that kind of goes through various aspects of place names. So it seems to run in the fall. So feel free to dip into that if you're interested. So what were the sources we used for our study? We looked through statistical accounts, Ordnance Survey name books, Ordnance Survey maps, which go back to about the mid-1800s, but then there's a collection of stories that go back even further, and travel diaries also that sort of help to extend those records past the written fisheries records to try to see a bit more about where oysters could be in our study area. We ended up looking through basically from the Solway to Skye was our search area, and ended finding actually some really interesting connections both with shellfish and habitat. So this is one of the place names that we looked into, Dorlin, which means tidal causeway, and these are just on a sort of broad scale pass, the locations where this place name appeared. So you can see they're actually quite broadly distributed. Then when we actually went and looked for historical records, these are where there were historical mentions of oysters being present. So there's actually a decent overlap there. And what we did ended up collecting this list of potential oyster habitat place names. We did at the start have a bit of a panic because in the first pass, the actual word for oyster, eisir, was only found in 2 places, both on the island of Mull. So what we decided to do then was broaden out a little bit and to look for habitats, but also references to shell. So Murach is shellfish generally, and Ochir is actually a shoal, a bank, or sand, which I'll go into a little bit as in a minute. And Slignach was also another one that came up referring to shells. Those are from Gaelic. The words from Scots and Norse also seem to have associations with these habitat types. So we included those. And this was one reference from the historical research, the historical records. So Loch Ryan actually had the earliest mention that we could find of a really sort of controlled harvesting of oysters. And that actually today, the Oyster Festival in Stranraer focuses on these populations, and it seems to be the best sort of beds in the country that still you can get oysters. So what we then did was went and tried to go to some of these place names to actually see what the substrate's like, see where would these be good places for oysters to grow. So we started focusing on the Isle of Mull, and the locations with the arrows show where the place names for oysters are. So our next steps, and I just started working on this over the past, since about September, is to go and actually do some monitoring, environmental data collection around these places. So these are the 2 places with Esserin in their in their place name, Elin na Esserin and Arsh na Esserin, which stand for Island of the Oysters and Point of the Oysters. So we're doing some soundscape collection to see if what the acoustic environment is. The little centrifuge tube on the right there that's attached into the substrate is a current, low-cost current meter, or current meter. Sensor, accelerometer to measure the direction and strength of the tidal flow. And we also are going to do some biodiversity data collection and substrate analysis here. So my colleague Alejandro Vodis has been working on developing these mini buoys to measure nearshore water movements with a low-cost technology. And yeah, as I said, we're measuring the soundscape ecology to look at the environmental health, see the diversity of sounds in these environments. We also are building these into a lesson plan, a bicultural lesson plan that can be delivered by schools to focus on this sort of the story of an oyster from the cultural perspective, the place names building into the environmental monitoring. So we're planning on doing some schools outreach where we take the children out and actually talk about oysters, talk about the substrate, the conditions they need to survive. So building a lot of the concepts and outdoor learning into the story of the native oyster. So I'm going to stop there. I think that's about right. See, these are some of our resources. And I will say we had other members that sort of participated at various stages in terms of particularly the kind of environmental sampling side.